Hello, and welcome to Heartbreak Stories. Today's story is about a man who spent years quietly building something most people never see, and a woman who didn't realize what she had until she threw it away in public.
She grabbed her boss's arm at dinner and told our friends she'd finally traded up. I nodded, buttoned my jacket, and walked out. What she didn't know was that every brick she'd ever stood on had my name on the deed. By morning, she'd find out exactly what that meant. My name is Sebastian Tillman. I'm 47 years old. I spent 21 years building something most people never see. Not a brand, not a public profile, not a LinkedIn headline. I built a structure. Quietly, methodically, the kind of financial architecture that doesn't show up in search results, but holds up entire city blocks of commercial real estate. My grandfather started the Tillman Legacy Trust in 1962, and my father passed the keys to me when I was 32. I never talked about it. Claudia knew it existed. She called it that old fun thing and moved on. That was always her way. If it didn't generate buzz, she wasn't interested. The dinner was held at Hartwell and Reed, a steakhouse in downtown Atlanta that Rowan Steele had rented out for what he called a vision evening. His words, not mine. 12 people around a long table. Investors, colleagues, a few mutual friends. I wore a navy blazer and said little. That's nothing new. I've always been more comfortable listening than performing. Claudia was electric that night. She'd been on a high ever since her commercial design firm signed a lease on a new flagship studio space. She posted about it 3 times that week. Champagne photos, captions about dreams and grind and manifestation. I'd smiled at each one and said nothing because that's what you do when you love someone. You support the performance even when you're not sure what's being performed. Rowan sat at the head of the table like a man who'd been practicing that posture since birth. 52 years old, silver-haired, the kind of tan that comes from ski trips rather than yard work. He had a Breitling on his left wrist and a habit of scanning the room while someone else was talking, as if he was always looking for someone more useful to speak to. Claudia was seated 2 chairs to his left. By the main course, she'd moved to the chair directly beside him. I noticed. Theo Baines, sitting across from me, noticed too. He gave me the kind of look old friends give when they're deciding whether to say something. He didn't. Neither did I. Then came the toast. Rowan raised his glass and said something about bold visions and the right partnerships. And Claudia, my wife of 16 years, reached over and placed her hand on his forearm. Slow, deliberate, the way you touch someone you've already claimed. She turned to the table, her eyes bright, and said it loud enough for every person there to hear. I've finally traded up. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was looking at him. The table went quiet in that particular way where everyone is suddenly very interested in their food. I heard someone set down a fork. I heard a woman near the end of the table release a breath. I set my napkin on the plate, pushed my chair back, and stood. No outburst. No trembling hands. I buttoned my jacket, 1 button, 2, straightened my cuffs, and walked toward the exit at the pace of a man who is somewhere better to be. Claudia called after me. Oh, come on, Sebastian. Don't make a scene. I didn't make a scene. I didn't even turn around. The valet brought my car in 4 minutes. A gray Volvo she used to call embarrassingly understated. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, watching the rain begin to dust the windshield. My phone was in my jacket pocket. I didn't look at it. I just sat there while the rain thickened, breathing slowly, letting the one sharp wave of feeling pass through me the way a storm passes through a valley, fast, total, and then gone. Then I started the car. Not to drive home. Not yet. There was a call I needed to make. One that I'd hoped I'd never have to make. But Claudia had just done something public, something documented, and something, though she didn't know it yet, contractually significant. I pulled out my phone and dialed Theo. He picked up before the second ring. I saw it, he said quietly. I know, I replied. What are you going to do? I looked out through the rain-blurred windshield at the glow of the steakhouse entrance, where a few guests had drifted outside, probably wondering where I'd gone. I'm going to let the paperwork do the talking, I told him. Theo was quiet for a moment. Then the trust, among other things. I ended the call, set the phone on the passenger seat, and finally pulled out of the parking lot. 16 years. She'd stood in front of 12 witnesses and announced she'd traded up. Fine. I'd spent 16 years making sure that every brick she ever stood on had my name on the deed. She was about to find that out. The office I keep on Peachtree Street doesn't look like much from the outside. No logo on the door, no receptionist, no waiting area with a water feature and motivational art. Just a frosted glass panel, a keypad, and a nameplate that reads Tillman Consulting by appointment. Claudia had been asking me to upgrade the space for years. Get something with a view, she'd say. Something that makes a statement. I never saw the point. The work was never in the appearance. I let myself in just after 10 that night, turned on the banker's lamp, the green glass one she'd been trying to get rid of since we moved in together, and sat down at my grandfather's desk. Walnut. Heavy. Scarred at one corner from move 30 years ago. She called the whole room a time capsule. I called it the one place where everything made sense. The Tillman Legacy Trust folder lived in the bottom drawer, behind a fireproof sleeve and a secondary lock. I'd opened it maybe a dozen times in 15 years. Tonight made 13. I laid it flat and turned to the tab section near the back. My grandfather had been thorough to the point of obsession, which is the only reason any of this was possible. He'd anticipated things no reasonable man would anticipate, including what the trust document called a public reputational event involving a beneficiary's spouse. The clause was clear. If such an event occurred and was documented, witnessed, recorded, or formally reported, the managing trustee was permitted to invoke an expanded authority provision. Effectively, it moved certain dormant assets from shared oversight into sole control. Full authority. Immediate effect. The dinner tonight had been documented before I even left the parking lot. A guest had recorded it on a phone. Theo had confirmed that within 20 minutes of my call. The clip was already in 2 separate group chats. I picked up my pen, initialed the activation page, and signed the bottom. Then I called the trust's legal liaison, a methodical man named Ed Coburn who had been handling Tillman matters for 11 years. Ed picked up on the 3rd ring. I heard, he said before I could speak. Then you know what I need. The activation form. Yes. A pause, the sound of keyboard. I'll file it with the administrator tonight. Expanded authority is effective at midnight per the clause. Good, I replied. There's one more thing. Pull up the Stroud file. A longer pause this time. Sebastian, are you sure? I understood his hesitation. Lawrence Birch, or Stroud, as my grandfather always called him, using the name of the shell company he'd hidden behind for decades, was not someone you engaged lightly. He was 69 years old, ran a private equity operation out of Charlotte, and had spent the better part of 30 years trying to chip away at Tillman Holdings through legal maneuvering, proxy battles, and a pipeline of strategic lawsuits. My grandfather had beaten him every time. My father had beaten him once. I'd never had to deal with him directly. But 2 weeks ago, Stroud had sent an intermediary, a quiet lunch invitation, relayed through mutual contact. I declined. Now, sitting in the dark with a signed activation form in front of me, I was reconsidering. Pull the file, I said. Don't reach out. Just have it ready. Ed confirmed and ended the call. I leaned back in my grandfather's chair and stared at the ceiling. The rain had followed me from the restaurant and was now pressing steadily against the window. The room smelled like old leather and wood polish, and something I could only describe as patience, the accumulated weight of decisions made without rushing. Claudia's firm had signed a lease 4 months ago, a flagship studio on the 7th floor of the Hartwell Commerce Center. She'd celebrated it like a conquest, photos, a dinner party, a blog post about finally arriving. What she didn't know, what she'd never bothered to ask, was that the Hartwell Commerce Center was managed under a subsidiary of the Tillman Trust called Ardenfield Property Group. I had co-signing authority on every major lease in that building. Her studio existed because I'd quietly approved it. I hadn't done it as leverage. At the time, I'd done it because she was my wife and I wanted her to succeed. But intentions don't rewrite documents. The lease was real. The authority was real. And tonight, she'd stood up in front of 12 people and declared herself free of me. I opened my laptop and pulled up the Ardenfield lease file. Clause 14b, reputational and conflict of interest review. Any public conduct by a lessee or affiliated party that created documented conflict with managing ownership could trigger a mandatory compliance review. She created that conflict herself, in front of witnesses, on video. I didn't initiate the review that night. I simply flagged the file and added one note: pending, monitor for formal trigger. Then I closed the laptop, turned off the lamp, and sat in the dark for a while. By midnight, the expanded authority was mine. I drove home at 12:14. The house was dark. Claudia's car was in the driveway, which surprised me. I'd half expected her to still be at the restaurant, working damage control. I went in through the side door, moved quietly through the kitchen, and went directly to the guest room. I didn't check my phone. I already knew what was on it. Her texts, probably escalating from casual to concerned to something sharper. They could wait. Everything could wait. I'd already done the only thing that mattered tonight. The paperwork had been signed. The clock had run to midnight. And while Claudia slept down the hall, the foundation under her feet had quietly, permanently shifted. I woke up in the guest room at 6:14 in the morning. No alarm, just the particular stillness of a house that's holding its breath. My phone was face down on the nightstand where I'd left it. I picked it up and turned it over. The screen showed a number that would have felt surreal if I hadn't already expected something like it. 132 missed calls. Claudia, starting at 10:47 the previous night, running through to 2:16 in the morning, then a gap, then 3 more starting at 5:50. Alongside those, 11 texts, escalating in tone from breezy to defensive to something that read less like a wife and more like a cornered negotiator. I scrolled past all of it. There was one message that wasn't from Claudia. It had come in at 1:08 in the morning from a number I recognized immediately. Raymond Foss, her father. He knows. Call me before you lose everything. I read it twice. Raymond Foss was not a man who used dramatic language. He was 71 years old, had spent 4 decades in commercial lending, and communicated with the efficiency of someone who billed by the hour, even in retirement. 6 words from Raymond meant something had rattled him badly enough to drop the professional mask entirely. I set the phone down, got dressed, and went to make coffee. Claudia was already in the kitchen. She was still in the clothes from last night. Blazer slightly wrinkled, hair pulled back in a hasty way that said she hadn't slept much. She turned when she heard me come in, and I could see she'd been rehearsing something. The expression on her face had that particular tightness of a speech prepared but not yet delivered. I poured my coffee and leaned against the counter. I said nothing. Sebastian. Her voice was measured. Careful. What happened last night? I need you to understand it wasn't what it looked like. I took a slow sip. What'd it look like? She blinked, thrown by the question. It was a joke. Rowan's been a mentor to me. I was being playful. The whole table was laughing. Half the table was silent. I replied evenly. Theo didn't laugh. The Hendersons looked at their drinks. And you weren't looking at me when you said it. You were looking at him. Her jaw tightened. You're reading into it. Your father texted me at 1 in the morning, I said. 6 words. He told me to call him. He seemed worried. That landed. Her posture shifted. Something behind her eyes recalibrated. The rehearsed version of this conversation suddenly not quite fitting the room anymore. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I set down my mug, picked up my jacket from the chair, and headed for the door. Sebastian, I have a meeting, I said without turning around. The meeting was real. I'd set it at 7:30 the night before, after leaving the office. Theo Baines met me at a diner on Roswell Road, a place we'd been going since our 30s, back when we were both figuring out what we wanted to be. He was already in a corner booth with 2 coffees when I arrived. How bad is it? He asked, pushing a mug toward me. I sat down. The clip's in at least 4 group chats. Raymond Foss texted me at 1 in the morning. Theo let out a slow breath. Raymond knows what the Tillman Trust means. That's why he's scared. He should be, I said. He co-signed a development loan through Ardenfield 3 years ago. If the compliance review moves forward, that loan comes under scrutiny too. Theo wrapped both hands around his mug. So his text wasn't a warning to you? No, I agreed. It was a warning to her. He's scared of what I might do. I paused. He's right to be. Theo was quiet for a moment. Then, and Rowan Steele? I've been thinking about Steele since the parking lot. The way he'd sat at that table. The The way he'd accepted her hand on his arm without so much as a polite redirect. A man who knew exactly what he was doing and didn't care who saw it. I had Ed pull his compliance history this morning, I said. Steele's firm has 2 pending disclosures with the state real estate board, both flagged for undisclosed relationship conflicts. Theo raised an eyebrow. He's done this before. Looks that way. I reached into my jacket and set a folded page on the table between us. And now he's done it with a woman whose lease runs through my trust, which makes it my problem, and his. Theo unfolded the page, scanned it, and set it back down without a word. Outside, the morning traffic on Roswell Road moved in its usual indifferent stream. People with ordinary Tuesdays. I envied them for about 30 seconds. Then I finished my coffee, put on my jacket, and went to work. Lawrence Birch called me himself. No intermediary this time. It was 3 in the afternoon, 2 days after the dinner. I was at my desk reviewing the Ardenfield compliance file when the phone rang. A number I'd stored years ago under a single word, Stroud. I stared at it for 2 rings, then picked up. Sebastian. His voice was the kind of smooth that comes from decades of practice. Rich, unhurried, faintly amused. Like a man who'd never once been caught off guard. I think it's time we had a proper conversation. You had my number, I replied. You could have called any time in the last 20 years. The timing wasn't right. A brief pause. It is now. We met that evening at a private club in Buckhead. His suggestion, neutral ground in theory, though everything about the place said old money and older grudges. Birch was already seated when I arrived. 69 years old, silver at the temples, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He rose when he saw me and extended a hand. I shook it. You don't refuse a handshake. You just remember whose hand it is. You look like your grandfather, he said as we sat. Same eyes. Same way of moving through a room like you already know where everything is. He taught me well, I said, including who to be careful around. Birch smiled at that. Genuine, almost respectful. He was a remarkable man. Wrong about me, but remarkable. I let that sit without comment. He got to it quickly, which I appreciated. Birch explained that he'd been tracking Rowan Steele's movements for 18 months. Steele, it turned out, had been quietly positioning himself to acquire distressed commercial properties across 3 Atlanta zip codes, properties that sat directly adjacent to Tillman Trust Holdings. The play was elegant in a predatory way. Create proximity conflicts, trigger compliance reviews on existing tenants, then swoop enduring the resulting instability. He used your wife, Birch said flatly, deliberately. He identified her connection to you 8 months ago and began cultivating the relationship. The word cultivating landed like a stone in still water. I kept my face neutral. What do you want in exchange for this information? I asked. Birch leaned forward slightly. Access. 1 parcel on the Chattahoochee corridor. The warehouse site your grandfather locked up in 1987. It's been sitting dormant for 30 years. I'd known the parcel would come up. It always did with Birch. My grandfather had acquired it specifically to keep it out of Birch's hands, and the 2 men had spent the better part of a decade in litigation over it. That parcel isn't for sale, I said. It never has been. I'm not asking to buy it. Birch tilted his head. A 10-year development lease. I build, you retain ownership. We both profit. I studied him for a long moment. The offer was genuinely reasonable, which made it more dangerous than any aggressive play would have been. Lawrence Birch didn't make reasonable offers out of generosity. I'll consider it, I said finally. But I need the documentation on Steele. Everything. Dates, communications, the acquisition strategy. He slid a flash drive across the table without hesitation. He'd had it ready. Of course he had. I picked it up, pocketed it, and stood. 1 condition, Birch added, remaining seated. Whatever you do with Steele, make sure it's airtight. Because the people he's connected to don't take losses quietly. I buttoned my jacket. Neither do I. I left the club without looking back. In the car, I sat for a moment with the flash drive in my palm. My grandfather's warning about Birch echoed somewhere in the back of my mind. Never trust a man who needs something from you more than he's willing to admit. But the information on Steele was real. I could use it without giving Birch a single thing in return, at least for now. I started the engine and called Ed Coburn. "We need to talk about Rowan Steele," I said when he answered. "All of it." Claudia came to my office on a Thursday afternoon. She hadn't called ahead, just showed up, which told me she'd run out of patience waiting for me to come to her. My assistant rang through to say she was in the lobby, and I told her to send Claudia up after 5 minutes. Small thing, but deliberate. I wasn't going to rush. She walked in composed, dressed well, chin level, the expression of a woman who decided that confidence was still her best play. She looked around the office once, the banker's lamp, the old desk, the walls of filing shelves, and I could see the familiar flicker of disdain she'd never quite learned to hide. "You've been avoiding me," she said, settling into the chair across from the desk without being invited to sit. "I've been working," I replied without looking up from the page in front of me. I finished the line I was reading, set the document aside, and gave her my full attention. "What do you need, Claudia?" She leaned forward. "I need you to tell me what's actually happening. I've had 2 calls from the Hartwell Building Management, something about a compliance review on my studio lease. My attorney says there's a conflict of interest flag on the account. I need to know if you did that." "I didn't file anything," I said, which was true. The compliance review was triggered automatically under Clause 14B of Release Agreement. It activates when a documented public conflict involves the managing ownership of the property. She stared at me. "What does that mean in plain English?" "It means the night at Hartwell and Reed was recorded," I said evenly. "Multiple recordings. They circulated. When the property management office saw the clip and cross-referenced the names, the clause activated on its own. I didn't make a single phone call." The color shifted in her face, not quite pale, but close. That's a technicality. No reasonable board is going to. The board doesn't have discretion under that clause. I cut in. It's mandatory review. Your attorney should have caught that when you signed. She sat back, recalibrating. Then, quieter, "Sebastian, we've been married 16 years. Whatever is happening between us, you can't let it affect my business." "I haven't touched your business," I said. "You touched it. The moment you made a public statement about a personal relationship in front of witnesses and cameras, you triggered a legal process that exists entirely independently of me." I paused. "There's something else you should know." I opened the desk drawer and slid a single page across to her. She picked it up slowly. It was the operating agreement for her firm, specifically page 9. The clause she'd insisted on 3 years ago, back when she was protecting herself from a difficult early business partner. I'd helped her draft the language myself. At the time, she called it her insurance policy. Her eyes moved across the paragraph. I watched the moment she reached the key line, "documented conflict of interest with a managing property holder," because her jaw tightened and her breath caught in a way she couldn't control. "This can't apply to me," she said, voice thinner now. "I wrote this to protect myself." "You wrote it to protect the company," I replied. "The company's board can now invoke it against any partner, including you." I let that land. "Your own attorney is on that board, Claudia. What do you think he's going to do when the compliance review results land on his desk?" She set the page down carefully, like it might detonate. "I didn't know," she said. It came out as barely a whisper. "I know you didn't." I folded my hands on the desk. "That's exactly the problem." She left 20 minutes later without another word. I watched her walk through the glass door into the corridor, straight-backed, controlled, every inch of her performing composure, and then I turned back to my desk and picked up the phone. Ed Coburn answered on the first ring. "The compliance review," I said. "Let it proceed at full speed." For days after Claudia's visit to my office, Rowan Steele held a press briefing. I heard about it from Theo before I saw the recording. He called me at 7 in the morning, voice carrying that particular flatness of a man delivering news he knows will sting even if it shouldn't surprise anyone. "Steele went public," Theo said. Full statement. He's positioning himself as the victim. I watched the recording an hour later. Steele stood outside his firm's downtown office in a crisp gray suit, flanked by his PR director and a woman I recognized as one of Atlanta's sharper defamation attorneys. He spoke for 4 minutes in a measured, regretful tone of a man who had practiced exactly this performance. He said that he had been introduced to Claudia Tillman as an independent professional seeking mentorship. that he had been unaware of the full nature of her personal circumstances, that certain statements made at a private dinner had been taken out of context and attributed to a relationship that existed only in a professional capacity, that he was deeply concerned about the reputational damage to his firm caused by an individual who had, in his words, misrepresented the nature of their arrangement to multiple parties. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. By noon, 3 business publications had run pieces framing Claudia as the aggressor in a professional boundary dispute. By 2 in the afternoon, 2 of her firm's largest client accounts had requested a pause on active projects pending clarification of the situation. She called me at 2:47. I let go to voicemail. Then I called Ed Coburn and asked him to forward all Ardenfield documentation to our outside litigation counsel. Not because I needed to do anything further, but because I wanted the record clean when everything else started moving. Theo came by the office that evening. He sat across from me in the same chair Claudia had used 2 days earlier and set his phone on the desk with the screen up, showing a message thread. Steele's personal assistant contacted me, Theo said. She's been with him 6 years. She's not happy about what he did today. I looked at the screen. The message was brief but precise. Dates, locations, documentation of a pattern, multiple professional women, similar situations, the same playbook run each time. Steele had done this before, systematically. She's willing to provide a formal statement, Theo added. Tell her to contact Ed Coburn directly, I said. Not me. I don't want my fingerprints on it. Theo nodded and picked up his phone. He sent the reply, then leaned back. You know what gets me? Steele thought he was using Claudia to get at your holdings. He had no idea you already had everything documented. He assumed I was the quiet one, I said. People always assume quiet means unaware. That evening I received the first piece of confirmed intelligence from the flash drive Birch had provided. Steele's acquisition strategy was exactly what Birch had described, a deliberate pattern of proximity manipulation, using cultivated personal relationships to create compliance instability in target properties. He'd run the same play in Charlotte 18 months ago. That case had settled quietly, which was why nobody knew. This one wasn't going to settle quietly. But there was something else on that drive. Something Birch hadn't mentioned explicitly, but had clearly included on purpose. Documentation suggesting Steele had financial connections to 2 offshore structures that were currently flagged in a separate federal inquiry. Not criminal charges. Not yet. But the kind of flag that turns a compliance review into something considerably larger. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called Miles Decker. Miles Decker showed up on a Wednesday morning without calling ahead. That was his way, always had been. We'd served together briefly in a logistics intelligence unit during my reserve years, 2 decades ago, and Miles operated on the assumption that a phone call gave people time to prepare answers rather than give honest ones. He preferred to catch the room as it was. I was in the middle of a document review when my assistant knocked and said there was a man downstairs who wouldn't give his name, but said I'd recognize the description. Compact build, gray jacket, no tie, scar along the left jawline. I told her to send him up. Miles walked in looking exactly the same as he had at 40. The kind of man who seemed to have reached a permanent age somewhere in the middle and stopped there. He shook my hand, looked around the office once, and sat down without being asked. You look tired, he said. I look fine, I replied. What's going on? He reached into his jacket and placed a folded document on the desk. Not dramatic about it. Just set it down the way you'd set down a grocery receipt. Rowan Steele, he said. You've been working the compliance angle. That's smart. But there's a layer under that you haven't seen yet. I opened the document. It was a summary, no official header, no agency markings, the kind of thing that gets passed between people who've worked in the same circles long enough to trust each other's judgment. 3 pages. Financial connections between Steele's development firm and 2 offshore structures in the Cayman Islands. Transactions running back 4 years. Dollar amounts that suggested the commercial real estate operation was, at minimum, partially a vehicle for moving money that didn't originate in commercial real estate. I read through all 3 pages before I spoke. How long have you known about this? Long enough, Miles said. I'm not here in any official capacity, but there are people I used to work with who are interested in Steele, and they're going to move on him in the next 3 to 4 weeks. When they do, anything connected to him becomes part of a much larger file. He paused. Including your wife's studio lease in the Hartwell building. I set the document down. The lease runs through Arden Field. Steele's name isn't on it. His money is, Miles said flatly. 2 of the anchor tenants in the Hartwell Commerce Center were placed there using funds routed through one of those Cayman structures. The investigators are going to look at every lease in that building as a potential placement vehicle. He met my eyes. Sebastian, I need to know whether the Tillman Trust has any financial crossover with Steele's network. Any at all. Because if there is, you need to know before they do. There isn't, I said. I've reviewed everything. The Trust's holdings are clean. Good. He stood. Then when this moves, you'll be a witness, not a subject. But you need to get your documentation in order now. Everything. Dated, organized, ready to hand over if asked. I walked him to the door. At the threshold, he paused. Turn back. One more thing. The woman at Steele's firm, the assistant who reached out to your friend Theo, she already contacted the investigators last week. Her statement is on record. He said it without particular emphasis. I'm telling you, so you're not surprised when Steele's attorney starts looking for the source of the leak. After he left, I stood by the window for a long time, looking at the Atlanta skyline. The situation had moved well past Claudia's dinner party stunt. Steele had built something deliberately rotten, and she'd walked into it without a second glance because it looked like an upgrade. She hadn't known. I was certain of that. But her ignorance wouldn't protect her from being associated with a federal inquiry unless I acted quickly. I called Ed Coburn and instructed him to formally sever the Arden Field lease with Claudia's studio. Not a termination, a structured transfer to a different property in the fund's portfolio. Cleaner address. No Steele adjacency. It would look like a routine management decision, because it was, technically, the Tillman Trust didn't carry damaged freight. Then I sat back down at my desk and thought about Lawrence Birch. He'd handed me that flash drive knowing exactly what was on it. He'd wanted me to find the Steele offshore connection, wanted me unsettled enough to consider the Cumberland warehouse deal more seriously. It was a long play, the kind my grandfather would have recognized immediately. I pulled out a legal pad and wrote 3 words at the top. Birch. Not yet. The warehouse could wait. Everything with Birch could wait. Right now, the only thing that mattered was making sure the Tillman name was nowhere near the blast radius when Rowan Steele's world came apart. I had maybe 3 weeks. I intended to use all of them. It happened on a Friday night. I was at the office late, later than usual, running through the reorganized Arden Field files before sending them to litigation counsel, when my phone buzzed with an alert from the building's security system. Not an alarm. A flag. Motion detected in the server room on the 3rd floor after hours. I had cameras in that server room. Not obvious ones. My IT manager, a careful man named Frank Odia, who'd been with the trust for 9 years, had installed them at my request 2 years earlier after a minor break-in attempt that never made it past the lobby. I pulled up the feed on my laptop. 2 men, one working at the primary server rack, the other standing near the door. The first man was methodical, pulling cables, inserting a device into the primary port, moving with the deliberate efficiency of someone who'd done this before. They weren't destroying hardware. They were initiating a remote wipe. Someone wanted the digital records erased. I called Frank first. He was on his way before I finished the sentence. Then I called building security, gave them a precise description of both men and their location, and told them to hold the individuals in place and not allow them to leave the building under any circumstances. Not police, not yet. I needed to know who sent them before I decided what to call it. While Frank drove over, I opened a separate system on my laptop. 18 months ago, after the minor break-in, I'd instructed Frank to set up a fully redundant backup. Not cloud-based, not connected to the main network. A physical archive server in a separate facility across town, mirroring everything in real time. Every document, every lease record, every trust transaction. If someone wiped the primary server tonight, they'd erase a copy. The original would be sitting untouched in a climate-controlled room on the other side of Atlanta. The 2 men were detained by security within 8 minutes. Building management called the police. I arrived 22 minutes after the initial alert, walked into the lobby, and found both men seated in the security office. Young, professional-looking, the kind of hired technical help that doesn't usually leave fingerprints on the actual job order. I didn't speak to them. I let the police handle the intake. What I did do was hand the responding officer a printed copy of the security footage timestamp and a brief written statement identifying the specific server room and its contents. Frank met me in the hallway outside. He was calm the way competent people are calm in a crisis. Focused, not rattled. Primary server was partially wiped, he said quietly. About 40% of the Ardenfield lease files. They didn't get to the trust transaction records. The backup, I asked. Untouched. Fully intact. He handed me a tablet showing the backup system status. Everything green. Whoever ordered this didn't know about the secondary archive. Nobody did, I said, except you and me. Frank nodded once, then went to deal with the police technical team. I walked back to my office, sat down, and thought about who had the most to lose from an intact Ardenfield file. Steele's name wasn't on any of the leases directly, but his financial connections ran through 2 of the anchor tenants. And if those transactions were ever cross-referenced with the offshore structures Miles had documented, the picture became very clear, very fast. He tried to burn the evidence before anyone could read it. There was something else, though. Something I'd been sitting on for a week and hadn't told anyone yet, including Miles. In the back of the Ardenfield master file, behind the tenant records and the compliance logs, was a single manila folder labeled Zone 4, pending transfer. Inside that folder was an original signed act, a document establishing a ground lease easement on a parcel adjacent to the Hartwell Commerce Center. A parcel that, if developed, would significantly increase the value of Steele's target acquisitions. The act had Steele's attorney's name on the preparation line, and Claudia's signature on the witness block, signed 8 months ago, well before the dinner party, well before I'd had any reason to be watching. She'd witnessed a document for his attorney without telling me. Maybe she hadn't understood what she was signing. Maybe she had. Either way, the act existed, it was intact, and now it was the most important piece of paper in the building. I locked it in the desk drawer, then called Miles Decker. "They came for the files tonight," I said when he answered. A pause. "Anyone get hurt?" "No, they got nothing." "Good." Another pause. "Sebastian, it means they're scared. Scared people make mistakes." "I know," I said. "I'm counting on it." Raymond Foss didn't call ahead either. He just appeared. I was in a meeting with Ed Coburn when my assistant knocked and said that an older gentleman was in the lobby asking for me by name and refusing to leave. I knew before she finished the sentence. I told Ed to give me 20 minutes and went downstairs. Raymond was 71 years old and looked every year of it that morning. Not frail, but carrying the particular weight of a man who'd spent several sleepless nights rearranging the story he'd planned to tell. He was dressed carefully as always. Gray suit, pocket square, shoes that had been polished that morning. He stood when he saw me come through the lobby door, and there was something in the way he rose, slower than usual, stiffer, that told me this visit had cost him something already. "Sebastian," he said. "Raymond." I gestured toward a pair of chairs near the window, away from the reception desk. "Sit down." He sat. I remained standing for a moment, then took the chair across from him. Between us was a low table and about 30 years of unspoken understanding that Raymond Foss had always liked having leverage and didn't know what to do when he didn't. He started carefully. "I want to talk about Claudia." "All right," I said. "She's made serious mistakes." He paused, choosing each word like a man navigating a floor he wasn't sure would hold. "I know that. I'm not here to excuse what she did. But she's my daughter, and I'm asking you, man to man, to consider whether the consequences need to be as complete as they appear to be heading." I looked at him steadily. "You sent her a text the night of the dinner. 6 words. You told her he knows, and to call you before she lost everything. I let that settle. You weren't warning her about me, Raymond. You were warning her about yourself." His jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. "The Ardenfield development loan," I said. "You co-signed it 3 years ago through a private arrangement with the trust's lending arm. 4,200 square feet of commercial guarantee on a project that never fully performed. That loan has been sitting in deferred status because I never called it in." I paused. "I still haven't." Raymond was very still. I'm not here to destroy your daughter, I continued. I'm not built that way. But I'm also not going to pretend that what she did was a misunderstanding. And I'm not going to sit across from her father while he asks me for mercy he doesn't have the standing to request. Raymond looked down at his hands. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "What happens to the loan?" "That depends on Claudia," I said. "If she cooperates with the compliance process fully, without obstruction, I'll restructure it. Fair terms. No penalty clauses." I leaned forward slightly. "But Raymond, if she lawyers up and fights this as though she's the wrong party, I will call every deferred note in the file, including yours." He looked up, not angry, something more complicated than that. The expression of a man who'd built his life on being the one who held the cards and had just realized he'd been sitting at a different table than he thought. "She didn't know about Steele," he said finally. "Not the real version of him." "I know she didn't," I replied. "That's the only reason this conversation is happening at all." He stood slowly, picked up his coat from the arm of the chair, and straightened himself to his full height. He extended his hand. I shook it. "I'll talk to her," he said. "Good," I answered. "Tell her to call Ed Coburn, not her attorney. Ed first." He nodded once and walked toward the lobby doors. I watched him go, a proud man carrying a smaller version of himself out through the glass. And then I turned and went back upstairs to finish my meeting. Rowan Steele was indicted on federal fraud charges 11 weeks after the dinner at Hartwell and Reed. I didn't watch the press conference. I read the summary in a brief email from Miles Decker. 4 sentences, no commentary, just facts. Steele's firm was dissolved. His assets were frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. His attorney had already entered a not guilty plea, which everyone involved understood was procedural. The assistant who'd contacted Theo, her name was Janet Coles, and she turned out to be the most important witness in the entire federal case, testified before a grand jury and described in precise detail how Steele had used personal relationships with professional women as instruments of proximity manipulation. At least 4 other women besides Claudia had been targeted over 5 years. None of them had known. Janet had known for 3 years and had finally decided that silence had its own cost. Claudia called Ed Coburn 2 days after her father's visit. She cooperated with the compliance review fully. No obstruction, no counterfilings, no attempt to reframe the narrative. The compliance process concluded that she had been manipulated by Steele into signing the easement document without understanding its function. Her culpability was found to be minimal. The studio lease was restructured under a different Ardenfield property at standard terms. Her firm survived, reduced but intact. 2 clients came back. A third one she rebuilt from scratch. I heard about this from Theo, not from her. Lawrence Birch reached out in the 9th week asking about the Cumberland warehouse. I sent him a letter, single page, Ed Coburn's signature, declining the development lease but offering a long-term storage licensing arrangement at market rate. Birch accepted without negotiation, which told me he'd expected far less. He got useful. I got what the trust actually needed from that parcel. My grandfather would have called it a satisfactory resolution. Raymond Foss's deferred loan was restructured in the 4th week, per my word. He didn't thank me directly. He sent a formal letter through his attorney acknowledging the new terms. That was fine. I hadn't done it for gratitude. The divorce was filed in the 8th week. Claudia didn't contest the trust's asset position. Her attorney reviewed the founding documents, understood the structure, and advised her that a contested proceeding would cost her considerably more than cooperation. She kept her personal accounts, her car, and the rebuilt version of her firm. She moved to a condo in Midtown. I kept the house. I'd built the landscaping myself 12 years ago. Some things you don't walk away from just because someone else suggested you should. Miles Decker sent me one final message after the indictment. Clean outcome. You ran it right. I kept that one. 8 months after the dinner at Hartwell and Reed, I sat at my grandfather's desk in the office on Peachtree Street, the banker's lamp throwing its green light across the same walnut surface it had illuminated for decades. The Tillman Legacy Trust was stronger than it had been before the night of the dinner. Not because of anything dramatic, but because the expanded authority had allowed me, to consolidate 3 underperforming positions into a single high-performing one. The kind of move that takes months of stability to execute. I thought about something Theo had said to me in the diner on Roswell Road, that first morning after. People always assume quiet means unaware. I turned off the lamp, locked the office, and drove home. The house was the same as it always had been. Solid, well-built, every brick laid with purpose. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and listened to the particular silence of a structure that had held through everything asked of it. That silence was the answer to every question the past 8 months had raised. Not loud, not triumphant, just steady. The way things build to last always are.
You know what I keep thinking about? He never asked for recognition. He just did things right and went back to work. That kind of quiet strength is rare. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.